Hello everyone and welcome to our WAPSEP-C online learning event. The title for this event is Congruence Revisited, a Shibboleth in Person-Centered Therapy with Beth Freire. Beth, a very warm welcome to online events.
Thank you.
It's lovely to have you with us here today. I guess you're up in Aberdeen tonight in the
Yes,
top of Scotland.
Scotland is a cold night, and welcome everyone, wherever you are, day or night. I don't know if I say good morning or good night. So for me, it's good night.
Yes, evening here in the UK, but of course not for everyone who's watching. Already we've had some feedback. We've got an international audience across the time zone. So a warm welcome to everyone who's here. And just a little note about some techie stuff before we get started, Beth, if that's all right. Do a little bit of housekeeping. Want to say hello to Saz, who's in the chat room, taking care of everyone. And a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us, like you said, Beth. We're going to take maybe 15-20 minutes for a presentation. Beth, you've prepared a PowerPoint presentation for us, and you've got a presentation to deliver. And during that time, we're not going to be taking questions from the chat room. But following that, we've got some time where you're going to open up for discussion, I guess. So we're looking forward to that. If anyone has a question for Beth and is struggling to get in the chat room, there's a little blue button at the bottom right hand corner of our website. It says Chat with Online Events. If you're having some techie difficulties, just press the button. You'll be straight through to Sandra and she can give you a hand to get in and ask Beth your question. So um, we're looking forward to that. Well, Beth, shall we get started?
Okay, so the topic I want to explore with you today is about congruence and what congruence means, and perhaps what it does not mean. And in my first slide in this PowerPoint, you can see I have a brief overview of what I think are the main misunderstandings of the three core conditions. And because not just congruence that I think is seriously misunderstood, but of course the other two conditions too. So, for instance, empathy, I think, is very common, mistaken as just a shallow reflection of the content of what the person, the client, is saying. For instance, in terms of active listening and paraphrasing, it's really a serious misunderstanding of empathy in person-centered therapy. UPR, unconditional positive regard, as well. There's so many misunderstandings and interpretations of the concept. And the main one is when people talk about positive regard and warmth and respect, actually dismissing the main thing about UPR, that's unconditional element of this attitude. But tonight I want to talk about congruence and what I think is the most controversial and misunderstood concept in client-centered therapy or person-centered therapy. And in the next slide, I'm taking this starting point is something I read from Sheila Hall. She wrote a paper many years ago, and it was the first time I saw this. I think it's very clever distinction between three meanings of congruence that Rogers used throughout his writings. And he used these three meanings as they were synonymous, but they aren't. So these three meanings are: the first is the idea of a matching between the organismic experience and the self-concept. So that's the meaning from the theory of therapy, and I'm going to explore this with you in a few minutes. The second meaning is about genuineness, and the third is about transparency. And what I'm going to talk to you tonight is about actually how these three meanings are different and actually independent. And how much the confusion around congruence is because Rogers used these three meanings interchangeably as if they were the same thing when they aren't. So I can say that we can blame Rogers for all these misunderstandings about congruence in a way, because that's the way he used these meanings as if it was the same thing. If you go to the next slide, when look at the first meaning of congruence, that's the meaning from the theory of personality. And in Rogers' theory, he defines congruence as this match between the organismic experience and the self-concept. And I have the next slide, the classical two circles diagram that Rogers presented in his book Client-Centered Therapy. You know, the 19 propositions, the last chapter of the Client-Centered Therapy book in 1951, when he really brings all his theory and with this diagram of two circles. So assuming people tonight are a bit familiar with the theory, I'm not going to explain in much detail at the moment, but basically just to remind you about this, what these two circles mean. So the circle on your right represents our self-concept, and the circle on your left represents the experience in the organism, the sensory and visceral experiences. And you can see that these two circles, they don't overlap completely, because we have experience in our self-concept that are not part of our organism. So they are the blue area, and these are what Rogers called the false self, because are what you think we are, but they're not really part of our organism. And you have the parts of our organismic experience who are not symbolized in our awareness, not part of our self-concept. And this is the yellow area there. And then when these two circles overlap, that's the experience who are in self-concept and also are real experience in the organism. This represents our congruence part, where we are congruent. So that's the next slide. You can see that it's really impossible to have two circles completely overlapping. But the bigger this area of congruence, of course, the more healthy you are, the more fully functioning we are. So ideally, therapy, you promote people's congruence, promotes this level of allowing our experience to be really integrated in our self-concept. And in the next slide, you will see then, as Rogers described and developed this concept further. And when he talks about a person who is congruent, is a person who is integrated, where all their organismic experience, or most of their organismic experience, are fully symbolized in awareness. Is a congruent person, has no defense, is open to experience. In short, that's the fully functioning person. So in the next slide, you can see actually when Rogers described the fully functioning person, that is the congruent person. These are the synonyms, they are the same concept. So in the next slide, you can see in a nutshell, like in a summary, when Rogers described a congruent person is a person who is open to experience, living the here and now, and trust their organism as the reference in their lives. So this is the congruence from the theory of personality, what it means in Rogers' theory. In that sense, if you go to the next slide, is in that sense that Gerald Bozar as well makes this point about congruence being an inner condition of the therapist, is the state of readiness of the therapist that enables them to experience empathic understanding and unconditional positive regard of the client. So it's really as a more kind of precondition of the therapist that gives them the openness to experience and the non-defensiveness to be able to experience empathy in UPR. So if you go to the next slide, so that's what as well a point that Gerald Bozar makes about congruence being this preparation, precondition of the therapist for the experience of the two other conditions. So this meaning of congruence is very clear in the theory, and it's very specific and objective definition of congruence. And then if you go to the next slide, you have a different meaning in some of others writings of Carl Rogers. He talks about the therapist being genuine. And what he meant by being genuine is about being real, not being a facade. So is the next slide, right? So in the sense that we're not pretending to be empathic, not being like a professional or making a pretense of acceptance. No, in this sense, the therapists, the empathy, the UPR are real attitudes. They are experienced in the moment. They're not just my techniques that I'm using here. I'm not doing empathy to my client. I'm being empathic. So in that sense, that's what Rogers meant by being genuine. But you can see here, genuine is not the same thing as congruent, as you saw just the previous slides. And then in the next slide, you can see another meaning that Rogers sometimes used, especially in his later writings. And he talked about the therapist being transparent. What he meant was the therapist being honest, being candid, and really disclosing what's going on in themselves. So Rogers is talking about the therapist's moments of self-disclosure, when the therapist makes a response that comes from the therapist's own frame of reference. And this is the meaning of being transparent. And this is a very different meaning from being genuine and being congruent. And just to clarify what this being transparent means, if you go to the next slide, I think you can somehow classify the therapist's response in two basic types of response. And this is a terminology from Barbara Broadley. She introduced this terminology of T response. So that means the response that came from the frame of reference of the therapist, in opposition to an empathic response. That's when the therapist is trying to be in the client's frame of reference and communicate their understanding of the client's frame of reference. So these are client's frame response or empathic response. So depending on which frame of reference your response came from, you can classify your response as being a T response or empathic response. And the next slide, I have a very simple example of this distinction, and can be very, very subtle, but they are very important and fundamental, this distinction, because in therapy, you know, sometimes the more subtle things, they're the more powerful. So for instance, if the therapist is, so the client is bringing something that's very sad, the client is really sad, or something really, or a bereavement, for instance. And the therapist might say to the client, oh, I feel so sad to hear that. So what the therapist is doing here is communicating their sadness, the therapist's sadness. So it's a response from the therapist's frame of reference. The therapist is sad. But if the therapist was being empathic, and if the therapist was resonating with the client's sadness, or being empathic with the client's sadness, they would say, I feel how sad you are, or you feel sad with this. So this is an empathic response. So the therapist is talking about the client's sadness, not their own sadness. So that's just to clarify what I mean by therapist and empathic response. In the next slide, we can see that in that's a point that also Barbara Broadley makes. How in client-centered therapy or in person-centered therapy, we really try to avoid the most we can to communicate therapist's frame response, because this response most often they involve some kind of judgment or conditional praise of client's experience, or some guidance, some direction. So the therapists in person therapy, they need this discipline to offer an empathic response most of the time, and to avoid this kind of judgmental or conditional response. And if you see the next slide, is a bit of diagram, as if when the therapist is responding to the client, they have a point when they need to make a choice, either of being transparent and communicate to the client their feelings, their own perceptions, their own evaluation of the situation, and making a therapist-framed response. And there is the risk of conveying some judgments about the client's experience. Or the therapist might choose to bracket that feelings, that judgments, put aside, and instead of being transparent and then communicating an empathic response that would convey a sense of unconditional acceptance of the client's experience. So what I mean with this slide to show that being transparent is the opposite of bracketing, and the therapist can very naturally to bracket their experience in order to convey empathy and UPR. And the next slide. So I'm trying to show now the difference between being transparent and being genuine. If you go to the next slide, we can say that a therapist can be very genuine at the same time that they are bracketing their personal reactions. So I don't need to be transparent to be genuine. I can be very genuine in the sense that my empathy is very real, my unconditional acceptance is real, but I'm bracketing my personal judgments, my own feelings, my personal reactions, because I don't think they will be helpful to my client. And the next slide, I want to show as well how being transparent is different from being congruent according to the meaning in the theory of personality. And if you go to the next slide, where I can bring here actually the three meanings of congruence according to Rogers' writings. And you can see these three meanings, actually they are independent. So congruence, as I said before, is about being on defensive, being fully functioning, having the organism experience fully symbolized in awareness. Being genuine is being real, not a facade. And being transparent is just being honest, being candid, and make a response from my own frame of reference. So my point here is that you can be very congruent in that sense here and not being transparent. You can be very genuine and not being transparent. So you don't need to be transparent to be congruent. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that actually also the opposite happens. You can have a therapist who responds very defensively, but with honesty and candor. So a therapist that can be very transparent, but incongruent. So a therapist can make a judgment, remark at self-disclosure, but in an incongruent way because they are being defensive. If you go to the next slide then, so you can see how then is what I said before about the therapist can be congruent and genuine, but not transparent. So if you go next, where then I make my point about instead of being transparent, you can bracket your judgments, your frame of reference. And you can still be very congruent, still being very genuine, but bracketing all this stuff that's not going to help your client. So you don't have to be transparent and disclose your judgments, your personal reactions, because what you want mostly is to convey unconditional positive regard and empathy. And now to finalize, now just kind of final conclusion, if you go back to the Rogers 6 conditions, the next slide, is a point that I think I think many people already know. If you look at the 6 conditions, look at the last one, and then for the next slide have the last condition, you can see that what Roger says is that the client needs to perceive the therapist's unconditional positive regard and the therapist's empathic understanding. There was no point in this hypothesis where Roger said that the client needs to perceive the therapist's congruence. So congruence is not something to be perceived by the client. You don't need to communicate how congruent you are to your client. What the client needs to perceive is your UPR empathy. So in that regard, so the next slide is just really a point that also Barbara broadly made about congruence is not something that you communicate to the client, and that's really a serious misuse of the term. I'm tired of hearing people say, oh, I was being congruent. I was communicating my congruence to my client. So you don't communicate congruence. You don't use congruence. Congruence is something that you have done like a homework. You prepare yourself before you see your client, your self-awareness, personal therapy, your self-development. You develop your inner congruence, your internal preparation. In that aspect, you can offer the empathy and UPR to your client. That's what the next slide to finalize with Bozart and Barbara Broadley quotations. So again, Gerald Bozart saying about the therapist's state of readiness. That's what congruence is about. And then the reference in the end, if people want to check my quotation. So this is my talk. I didn't want to talk too much and really looking forward to people's questions, comments, reactions.
Well, thank you, Beth. That was so succinct and really very well argued. Yeah, thank you. And thanks for just kind of going for it and getting us right through the presentation. Really appreciate that. You look like you're ready for a little drink of water there.
Yeah, no, just ready for the questions.
Yeah, yeah. So, and we've got some comments in the chat room already. Yeah, so you're ready for some thoughts, for some feedback, and please, if you're watching, if you do have something you'd like to ask Beth, please pop it in the chat room. Okay. Okay, some people saying thank you, that you made some excellent points. So are you saying that kindness is all important within core conditions with limitations on congruence?
Kindness.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat again?
Yeah, no problem. I know I've got a little bit of a cold tonight, so hopefully you can bear with my pronunciations. Are you saying that kindness is all important within the core conditions with limitations on congruence?
I think kindness is perhaps even before anything. I think in your conditional acceptance, in your empathic understanding, of course, kindness is part of that. You need to, and there's another talk I have about what it means to be empathic and to convey unconditional positive regard. And I like to see that as having a number of components. And one of the components of this empathic acceptance attitude is the sense of awe towards the other human being, this openness, this receptiveness, the no expectation, the no attachment, and this compassion. So I think kindness is part of this overall sense of receiving the person with compassion, acceptance, and openness. So we need to be kind to be able to receive the other with this respect and unconditional acceptance. I don't know if that's the response to the question. And I think when people think that congruence means being transparent and to bring other things that are not part of this empathic acceptance, so that's where I think the problems arise. So I think you need really to be careful about, well, if this is not empathy, if this is not UPR, why do I bother to bring that? So it's better to practice, to keep quiet, keep aside, take to your personal therapy, take to your supervision, and see what was that came up on you while you're listening and receiving the client. We don't have to be transparent about this experience, because what we want to convey to our client is a conditional acceptance most of all.
Yeah, okay, Beth, that feels really clear, and well, and there might be more feedback on that question in the chat room, so we'll keep our eyes open for that. This question was asked earlier on in your presentation, and I think you've just answered it, but it's worth asking that again just to really clarify what you're saying, Beth. Which that maybe therapist self-disclosure might be part of later therapy once the relationship is formed. I think that is a way of formulating therapy, but that's not what you're saying, I guess, that therapist
Yeah.
disclosure is.
So what is the rationale for bringing that later? It's not clear. So why later would be okay and earlier would not be okay? I think the, does the depends of what's the theoretical model that you are working with. So what is your aim with your therapeutic meeting with the client? What do you want to promote there? So if your aim is to promote the client's self-acceptance and openness to experience, and what the theory says is that the more you offer empathy and unconditional acceptance, the more you promote the client's inner self-acceptance and self-empathy. In that model, why you'd want to bring something else? Why do you need to? Why would you make a self-disclosure? What was the intention of a self-disclosure? Is there any theoretical justification for that? I mean, in the person-centered model, the theory does not justify any other kind of intervention. Unless you work with another model, you might have a different theoretical justification for that. That's fine. But within the person-centered model, it feels like what you're there to offer to a client is unconditional acceptance through empathic understanding, and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, like that is the model.
In the last session, in the middle session, all the time is a consistency as well is fundamental. For the unconditional positive regard, it's important the client to feel they can trust you, they need to feel safe. So your unconditional positive regard needs to be consistent. So if you are very empathic, very unconditional accepting, and out of the blue, someday you suddenly changed and do something different, and it's going to damage the sense of safety and trust in the relationship. So the client feel, now I don't know what to expect of you. So perhaps they might feel less safe and feel like, oh, that's something I didn't know you could say something like that, and now everything will change. And why you'd want to change the dynamics? Why don't keep this consistent empathic understanding? Because there is a really very precious process that's emerging out of this consistency of your empathic acceptance.
Well, that sounds really important what you're just saying there, Beth, that if we then move to therapist disclosure, we're changing the experience of the relationship, and that could change the levels of trust then from the client.
Is the thing of really being clear which model you're using your work. I'm not saying that in different models you have to work in different ways and have a response from different formats. And that's part of the model. And then there are a set of techniques and tools you might want to use in different modules. But be clear about which model you're using, and be clear of, well, why this self-disclosure now? Do I know what I'm doing? Do I know the consequence of that? Do I know how my clients are going to receive that? And what I'm expecting to happen out of this? And so it's really important not to improvise with clients. No, it's so, they might be so, usually most of the time clients come to us because they feel vulnerable. So a lot of there's no power dynamics there. And everything we say, because if you vulnerably look at us like, oh, you are the ones who are going to save us and rescue us. So everything you say comes with a big weight. And we think it's very kind of naive self-disclosure. It was saying slightly comments that came to me in the moment, but actually don't know how the client are going to take it and with the impact they're going to have on them, because you are the therapist and look at you as someone who really knows things.
Yeah.
And it depends when a friend saying something to them, they might say, oh, they might dismiss very easily what a friend says. But if you, the therapist, say something that you feel like, and it might take very seriously. So really be careful when you bring a frame of reference. Make sure you know what you're doing.
Yes.
And don't say, oh, I'm just being congruent, because that's not really a proper explanation for why you are bringing your frame of reference.
Yeah. To really not underestimate, Beth, the impact of every word that we say on a client, because they're in that state of vulnerability, they're really listening to us. And so if we do bring something that contains a judgment or something that's really for us or about us, that could throw the relationship. Or
They brought all yourself to you. They expose themselves so deeply, and they are so naked in front of you. And if you make any slightly judgment of their experience, that can be very harmful and have a huge impact. Or even if it's a positive judgment, if they can actually start to rely on your evaluation of their experience, so can reinforce the externalized locks of evaluation. So even a positive appraisal has as well his negative impact in terms of reinforcing these externalized locks of evaluation. And there's something so magic and so beautiful, so precious about this consistent empathic responding. This kind of way, we said the word, like wherever the client goes, you are there with them in this empathic, accepting way. And this creates some kind of safety and trust that's so precious, and they're not going to get this elsewhere. Because people elsewhere, they do the self-disclosure all the time.
right, okay.
Whoever they talk to in their lives, people are going to give their opinions, their views, their evaluations, their reactions. So this people's frame of reference response is the normal, is the given. But in the person-centered counseling, it's so unique, because where else people can be listening that way, where their frame of reference actually is in the center, and their experience is unconditionally accepted and fully understood with not external comments.
Yes, yeah, like it is a really unique experience, and why then just do what everyone else does?
Exactly.
The person's coming to us for a different experience.
And why do the same? So you don't need to do the same as everyone else does.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, so Beth, that sounds really clear and passionate. You feel so strongly about this stuff. Yes. Thank you. There's so much going on in the chat room. Let's see if I can just plug into some of this. So something about disclosing unimportant facts about self initially, almost as a gift, and as the relationship develops, I would disclose more personal information after asking if the client wants to hear it. So something about offering something of ourselves in the form of disclosure. I wonder, how does that fit in where you're thinking,
So,
Beth?
two things here. First is what you call selves. So what's myself that I'm offering to the client? And there is a concept in theosophy and anthroposophy and some spiritual traditions, and they talk about people having a higher and a lower self. I don't know if that distinction makes sense to people, but somehow I think it's something useful to have in mind, bear in mind when I'm responding to our clients, because I'm making an empathic response and being the client frame of reference does not mean that I'm not there. Doesn't mean that I'm a robot and just a machine repeating things. Of course, I'm 100% fully present. Myself, I'm fully present, but it's a part of myself who is unconditional and compassionate and empathic. And the part of me who has my own preference, my own appraisals of experience, my judgments, this is what they would call a lower self. I don't know if people like this terminology. They don't need to use the terminology, but sense of I can brag to that. It does not mean because I'm bragging these parts of myself, does not mean that I'm not being there fully percent, 100%. So why would be a gift to my client to offer these parts of me? Why is not a gift to offer my empathic me? So I think my empathic response are the best gifts I can give to my client. And the most precious thing I can offer to them is my empathic understanding. And what I think of life, I don't think it's that important. And as I said, they can have these people's opinions elsewhere. You don't need me to have my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. So like the client can bump into those lower selves everywhere, I guess. And as humans we all carry a sense of prejudice and fractiousness, and so we all
Yeah,
have that. And
yeah, I don't think we are friends with our clients. So actually, it's agreed of mutuality. I want that to be a friend and to respond to my client as a friend would respond. I think I can offer something much better than that and much more special. They're not going to get with friends, and that's my empathic, consistent, empathic, accepting response.
yeah. So that's what separates out what you offer from what someone's going to get from their friends. That you're going to stay in that client-centered response, client frame of reference.
Consistently, that's the key thing.
Ah,
The
yeah,
consistency is that really makes this really special and magic and out of the words in a way for the client.
yeah. That they know that they're going to get that from you, Beth. That
Yeah.
when they come and see you, that you will not depart from that. You will stay in their frame of reference.
And gives a lot of safety for the client, and they can feel they can trust me.
Yeah,
Because especially some clients have something really traumatic or very vulnerable parts of themselves. They really need to trust the therapist a lot before they even show a little bit of that. So some clients trust the therapist is a big thing. Takes a long time, and the more empathic, consistently empathic you are, the more they can trust you.
yeah. Yes, if they see that over and over again, that they know that you will stay in that. I'm thinking a little bit of devil's advocate almost, if that's an okay expression to
That's
use. So if the client's kind of wondering about, well, where is the rest of you, and what is it doing? And maybe the client might reach out for a sense of that too. Do you have a kind of response to that, or a thinking about that?
sorry. Say again. Not sure if I understood your question.
Like a client might wonder about, well, where are my judgments? Do I feel anything else about them? Is there anything else? Like I love them and I understand them in terms of their frame of reference, but a client might reach out and say, well, is there anything else, John? Is there anything else that you feel or your experience about me?
Yeah, so there's the thing that Barbara broadly as well discussed about, well, what do you do when client asks for our views, our opinions? So
Yeah,
Barbara would say, well, I'd offer what they're asking. I'd say what they're asking. So if the client really directly asks me, what do you think? So Barbara would say what she thinks. And I like before before I respond what I think, I first try to respond empathically because most of the times actually it's not really what I think the client wants to know. There's the intention, the meaning of the question actually is something else. So client might be looking for reassurance because they might want to feel so expecting criticism. So there's really the key thing is the empathic connection there. So I can listen to my client. If I'm really empathically connected, I can also understand where this question comes from. So I want to attend to that. So I respond to that. And most of the time, that's what the client wants, and they move on. But if the client really wants to know objectively that's the really content of the question. Of course, I give to them, but I always give with empathy. So I have an example. A client of mine, she was really struggling with a relationship with a boyfriend, and she was talking about this relationship, and eventually she asked me, "Oh, what do you think? Should I split up with him or not?" And instead of saying to her what I thought about whether she should split or not, I, for my empathic connection there, listening to her, I felt actually there's a lot about not trusting herself and her capacity of making a decision. So that's what I offered to her. So I have a sense that you really don't feel like you can trust that you can make the right decision here. When she listened to that, she it really opened up a huge thing for her about actually how much she doesn't believe in herself and how much sense of self-worth and so on. So she really moved on a lot. And actually, what I thought about this decision was completely relevant.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
actually, something much bigger than that, she was really asking for about whether she would be able to make a good decision herself. So that's what I mean. But you don't have to first thing just straight away to respond the client's question. But if you're really empathically tuned, you also can hear more
Yes.
that
Yeah.
question. Not me dismissing the question and put the question back. That's very dismissive. But responding with empathy most of all.
Yeah.
And if really the client wants to know, of course you tell. If the
Yes.
client says no, but I want to know what you think. Of course, it'd be very disrespectful and dismissive not to respond.
Yeah. I really appreciate you saying that, Beth. It's not like a rule of never ever any therapist disclosure, but it's like it sounds so empathic what you're saying, or that
Especially not on an own initiative, not like, oh, out of
yeah,
the blue, I decide to say something, even
right,
asking. That's what my main point.
yeah, yes. Like if the client really, really wants to know your thinking, you will respect that and offer what you feel you can, I guess.
But not to assume that the client wants to know what I think even before they ask.
Yes, yes. Which can come from we might be so anxious about what we think that as soon as there's a question remotely connected to that, it spills out, and that's the moment we say, "Oh, I'm just being congruent." I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or if you have a very strong reaction of the client is saying, and you feel like I'm going to be congruent and tell them how I feel about this. But the client is in their process, doing their thing and trying to understand themselves. Why am I going to mess up and take the client away from where they are with my thing?
Yes.
Very disrespectful in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. To lead the client away from themselves. Yeah.
Assuming that my views is important to them. Who do you think you are? That you think your view is really important to them?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I can get what you're saying, Beth.
Humility is important.
Yes. Yes. For sure. For sure. Beth, this is so interesting. I can feel myself just locked in conversation with you, and I want to make sure I have another look at the chat room. And we've got about 15 minutes to go. If anybody, I'm sure I've missed questions, so if anyone wants to put their question in again, please do, um, so that we spot it. Just noticing one here. Are you saying that the therapist's fidelity to communicating only empathy and unconditional positive regard is the shibboleth by which client-centered therapy is recognized?
No, the shibboleth in the title is the sense of how I think people, when they misuse congruence in the sense of excuse to be honest, being transparent. So become like a jargon, like something that people become like really a fancy words, and people use that to as if that means to be person-centered is being myself and being candid and being honest. So that's what I meant, like what bit of provocative title, the shibboleth.
Yes, so it's a bit of a being a bit of a provocateur, I guess, in terms of the title. That like you're saying that it's something other than person-centered theory, I guess. If someone is using that kind of approach,
I
it's
think it's a misunderstanding of person-centered. It's a misuse. I think, and I said in the beginning, I think you can really blame Rogers for this, because when he
okay.
started to use congruence in this loose way, when he was actually talking about being genuine or being transparent, and then he made this confusion because actually being congruent in his theory is something very specific, well defined, and not in this loose sense of just being myself. Being myself. And I like Lisbeth Sommerbeck when she criticized this expression, being myself. She says, when we're not ourselves, I mean, I cannot be John Wilson. I always be Beth Freire. When I'm responding to my client, I'm always Beth responding to them. I'm not someone else. So it's a bit meaningless to say being myself. Of course, Rogers meant being, I don't know, it's not clear what Rogers meant. That's the problem, the confusion, what Rogers meant by being oneself and being doing self-disclosure, or being real. Probably he meant being real and not a facade, not a pretense. So that's fine. But I can practice all my personal response and still being very real, very present.
Yeah, so so that was really clear in your presentation that we can still be there, present and real, and that transparency is a choice, I guess, a theoretical choice. Yeah,
I don't have the clients don't need to see all the struggles or the things are, the parallels process in my mind. There is the main process in my mind is empathic and trying to understand and be in their shoes and trying to communicate my understanding, acceptance. All the parallel, small little process there, they need to be kept I need to master them. It's about mastering yourself and practicing stuff that's not helpful and relevant.
Yeah, because there was a question a little bit earlier about the homework for congruence. Is that what you're talking about? Our need to be in our own personal therapy and self-development?
The more you are self-aware, so if you look again what congruence means in the theory, this when the two circles almost overlap the most. So it means that most of your experience in the organism, you are aware of them. They are symbolized in your self-concept and awareness. So it means that you can master your experience. So you have some reaction here, some gut feeling or something. You can easily in the session master that and say, okay, it's really triggered something about my own experience. For instance, let's say an example, there was a bereavement and the client talked about the loss and really reminds of your own loss of something happened. It was just, oh, that's my loss, what happened to me. So keep quiet. So you can easily master because you have already made your homework. You have processed your loss in your therapy, in your personal life, and your supervision. So it's something you know of yourself. So you can really own that and say, oh, that's me. Please be quiet here. I'm listening to my clients. I'm still with them. And my own bereavement loss is mine. I don't need to put that on the client's way and take them away from their process. But if I haven't done my homework, if I'm defensive, so I won't be able to do that. I start to respond, acting out. I'm going to respond to my client, thinking that it's empathy when it isn't. I'm going to talk to them. Actually, it's my loss that's talking, and I completely mess up because I haven't mastered myself, and I haven't done my homework. I'm coming from a very incongruent place, very judgmental place myself.
Yeah, so we're kind of leaking out with our clients in a way that isn't helpful.
So self-awareness is our fundamental tool in a way. The only thing we need to be a person-centered therapist is to have self-awareness.
That is the tool in the tool bag.
In the sense of the more fully functioning I am, the better therapist I am.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Beth. Yes, thank you. So I'm not quite sure what this question means. Let's ask it, see if it means something to us. If not, maybe we can get more feedback from the chat room. Are you saying that congruence is outmoded? Question mark. So
I think it's overrated.
Oh, okay. Can you say a bit more about that, Beth?
Yeah. So I think. When Lisbeth Sommerbeck as well and Marvin Franco, they talk about Rogers 1 and Rogers 2. I know that's very controversial, though many people disagree with that. For instance, Barbara Broadley, she did research on Rogers' plaques, and she says there was not much change in Rogers throughout his life. But in the theory, there was a small change when he thought congruence as a condition of the therapist. And so before that, Rogers would emphasize the unconditional acceptance as the key fundamental aspect of person therapy. So accepting the client empathically was the main thing until 51. And then in the kind of, when we went to California, this countercultural movement, the new era, no, new age thing. So the growth movement, encounter movement. So being myself became a big thing. So a fancy thing to be myself was part of the 70s, the culture of the 70s. So I think that's why things became overrated, the sense of, just being free of all conventions of society and just being honest, being transparent. So I think it was really overrated, and especially in encounter groups. And I think I'd stay with them when it started about the importance of unconditional acceptance and empathy. Actually, this should be the main thing. They are the main thing, and really also clarify that congruence is not being transparent. They're two different things. That helps us out.
Yeah, so that's really important to separate out those two concepts, congruence and transparency. And it sounds like you're saying maybe how congruence is thought about a lot in the current person-centered world is really to do with a cultural shift that was going on in the late 60s, early 70s, where the individual kind of broke free and became more prominent. And
I think that was how it started.
And there's a lot more thinking now about how we are so much part of a system, I guess, and that Western individualization isn't matched in other cultures, I guess.
I think if you go back to the empathic acceptance, this is universal. I mean, it's cross-cultural, and it's part of basic human need, to be accepted, to be loved, to be received. Is you can everywhere people need that, but everywhere people benefit that. So it's really universal, and that's the most basic, fundamental component of person-centered counseling. And this bit about being myself, being transparent, and being free is very Western individualistic thing, isn't it? It's not so. And also there's something about this empathic acceptance that requires some inner discipline. I think the word discipline, people don't like it.
Okay.
No, because this idea of being myself, like freeing of all the words for that, sorry. But I think if you go back to this consistent empathic presence, empathic listening, you need to be very, not constrained in the way that you tied yourself up, but really in terms of mastering and know what you are doing, being grounded, being still. It's hard work.
Yeah.
Not just improvise and let it happen. No, it needs to be really 100% there and fully concentrated and focused. It's hard work, and that I think Beth might feel easier just to feel free yourself and just to say what comes in the moment, disclose whatever. And I don't like this improvisation with clients. I think it can be very dangerous and harmful many times.
I really get that sense, Beth, from you. It just is not okay. But I think then it can be easy for people to think about the approach as a kind of, well, there's not much to it, but actually the discipline of that, staying with a client, staying in their frame of reference is hard work with the client, and in terms of our own development, it is a massive discipline.
And being attentive to our own defenses when they come, and being aware, attentive when I lose my client, when I go away and go astray, and really be very careful to go back on track. Really how to ground yourself in the here and now and not going there and then. Stay there in the here and now with your client. Yeah, it is not easy.
So there's an energetic endeavor in that approach, I guess, to continually come back and be with the client right where they are. Not just the kind of, just repeat some of the words the client has said.
No, it's not a shallow repetition at all. It's a presence. It's really to be 100% fully present there in the here and now.
Yeah, yeah. That 100% presence. That's the discipline and the clarity, I guess.
And not go astray in your mind with your thoughts and but just being where the client is, in companionship and with an unfaltering companionship,
Yeah,
closer as you can.
I really like that. And
So, but the client can go over the place, and you have to go along with them. Or they can go very dark, scaring place and be there with them without being scared. No, so this really is very demanding. Might
yeah,
be just to come with something else and to distract the client with your personal reactions.
yeah. Well, I think that is catching something in the chat room. Um, a comment of feeling inspired and challenged to be disciplined, but feeling the expectation is high. Like, is there something in the client seeing us not being perfect, or like, do you have a thought about if we do falter? I really like that unfaltering accompaniment, but what about when we do, or do you, Beth? Do you ever have those moments of,
For me, like my motto is always come back to the here and now. So whatever happens, back to the here and now. So where is the client now? Go there where they are. So if you lost the client and you said something and whatever, okay, now where the client is, and go back there.
yeah,
And now it's simple as that. So you don't need to justify, explain, or just where you are. But if the client was affected, if the client was hurt, if the client something, it will be there in the here and now.
yeah,
So they'll tell you hear that, so you're empathic. So whatever happened, if there was any negative effects on the client, you'll be there. You're going to, in your empathy, you'll be back and you listen to that and respond to that. You say, oh, like what I said has just, you felt hurt, whatever. I don't know, just make up
yeah,
whatever the, what the client is feeling in the moment, the here and now, your empathy, you tell you and put you back on track.
yeah. Thank you for that, Beth, because I guess sometimes we do kind of wander off into our own little worlds and then realize we're, yeah, miles away from the client, and but to get back to where they are, there will be an impact. To hear that, to get back
Don't need
into
to
the,
take your client where you are. So because you're there, don't need to bring your client where you are and just justify, explain to the client what happened. You just go back where they are and start from there again.
yeah, and that seems so key to what you're saying. It's not like saying, to, "Oh, there's something really interesting over here." It's like, where are they? Yeah,
What's happening here and now, and respond empathically to that.
yeah,
So that you listen, that you sense, that you feel what the client is sensing, feeling, and saying.
yeah. Beth, we've just got a minute to go. The time has just come and gone in a flash. Wow. I just want to say thank you for a very clear exposition of that, of the theory and the presentation, and talking that through with us as well. It's a real sense of how you see the theory and the discipline of the theory. And the hard work of that. Yeah, feels like you haven't shied away from a difficult conversation. Thank you. Yes, and I know there's a lot more comments and questions we just didn't manage to get to in an hour. There just isn't the space
So
for everything.
it's a shame I cannot really interact directly with people with their questions. So I wish I could really address everyone's questions directly. So apologize if I can't.
Yeah. I know you were saying that earlier. You really would have loved to have everyone in the room and you can see everyone and just get into.
Their eyes and the here and now, and to respond what's happening in the here and now with them. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, thank you for stepping into a very different kind of medium and and embracing it for us, and addressing a lot of comments and questions to really help us clarify those ideas. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you
Really appreciate that. And
for this opportunity as well. Thank you for the invitation. I feel honored by that.
welcome. It's a real joy for Sandra and I at Online Events to be working with WAPSEP-C and to have these moments where we can really get into the theory and say, what is this about, and what is our rationale, and how do we do what we do. Yeah. And thank you to everyone who's joined us on the website live today. It's been great to have your presence here, and for taking some time, if you have, to put in comments and questions. Thank you for that too.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you, Beth. Thank you, everyone. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone at our next event. Bye for now.
Bye.